The river's roar swallowed her screams as Penelope Lawson tumbled downstream, her fingers clawing desperately at slippery rocks and submerged branches that offered no salvation. The rushing waters of the North Platte had claimed many lives before, and on this spring day in 1878, it seemed determined to claim one more. Gideon Tucker was no stranger to death. He'd buried his wife and infant son 3 years prior, and since then, the 30-year-old rancher had existed rather than lived, tending his modest spread outside Cody, Wyoming territory with mechanical precision. His days followed the same pattern: rise before dawn, work until exhaustion, sleep dreamlessly, repeat. It was a hollow existence, but one that required little of him emotionally, which suited him just fine. On this particular morning, Gideon had ridden to the river to check his livestock's water access when something caught his eye: a flash of fabric against the rushing current, then the pale arc of what looked like a human arm. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse downstream, following the flailing form as it was swept along by the merciless water. When the river bent sharply, the current slammed whoever it was carrying into a tangle of fallen cottonwood at the edge of the water. Gideon dismounted in a fluid motion, secured his horse to a nearby sapling, and waded into the frigid water. It was a woman, face down and motionless, her dark hair swirling around her like river weeds. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, was torn and waterlogged, weighing her down. With his heart hammering against his ribs, Gideon hooked his arms beneath hers and dragged her to the muddy shore. She wasn't breathing. Her lips were blue, her skin ashen. Gideon had seen enough death to recognize its approach, but something in him, something he thought had died with Sarah, and little James, refused to accept another loss. He turned her onto her side, pounding between her shoulder blades until water gushed from her mouth. When that didn't rouse her, he pressed his palms against her back, forcing more water from her lungs. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice hoarse with an emotion he couldn't name. "Damn it, woman, breathe." As if heeding his order, the woman suddenly convulsed, coughing violently as river water spewed from her mouth. She gasped, a harsh, desperate sound that was the sweetest thing Gideon had heard in years. Her eyes flew open, deep brown and wild with fear, before rolling back as she slipped into unconsciousness again, but this time with shallow breaths moving her chest. Gideon gathered her in his arms, this stranger who now represented something he'd never expected to feel again: hope. He placed her carefully on his horse and mounted behind her, cradling her against his chest for the ride back to his ranch. He didn't know who she was or what had happened to her, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't going to let her die. The journey back to his modest ranch house seemed interminable. The woman remained unconscious, occasionally coughing up water but never fully waking. By the time Gideon carried her through his front door, her breathing had steadied, but her skin remained cold to the touch. He placed her on his bed, the only proper one in the house, and worked quickly to remove her soaked clothing. Modesty be damned, he'd seen enough hypothermia in his years out west to know that wet clothes could kill as surely as a bullet. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, built up the fire in the small iron stove, and set water to boil. Only when he'd done everything he could think of did Gideon finally take a proper look at the woman he'd rescued. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with features that might be considered handsome rather than traditionally beautiful: a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and a straight nose currently blue tinged from cold. Her dark hair, drying now by the fire's heat, curled slightly around a face unmarked by the sun, suggesting she wasn't from these parts. As night fell, Gideon settled into a chair beside the bed, prepared for a long vigil. Around midnight, the woman's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her expression. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from the river water. "My ranch," Gideon answered, leaning forward. "About 5 miles outside of Cody. I pulled you from the North Platte this morning." She blinked slowly, processing his words. "You saved me." It wasn't a question, but Gideon nodded anyway. "Name's Gideon Tucker." "Penelope," she whispered. "Penelope Lawson." Her eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing remained steady. For the next 2 days, Penelope drifted in and out of consciousness, battling a fever that left her alternately shivering and sweating. Gideon neglected his ranch work to tend her, spooning broth between her cracked lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, bathing her forehead with cool cloths when the fever raged. He sent word to Doc Wilson in town, but spring flooding had washed out the bridge, making the journey impossible for at least another day. On the morning of the 3rd day, Gideon woke in his chair to find Penelope watching him with clear eyes. "You look terrible," she said, her voice stronger than before. A rusty laugh escaped him, the sound foreign to his own ears. "Reckon that's my line, madam." Penelope attempted to sit up, wincing as she did. "How long have I been here?" "3 days now." Gideon poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and helped her drink. "You've been fighting quite a fever. And you've been caring for me all this time." Her eyes, he noticed now, weren't merely brown but flecked with gold, like sunlight through whiskey. "What of your wife?" "She must be put out, having a stranger take her bed." "No wife," Gideon said simply. "No one to put out." Something in his tone must have discouraged further questions, for Penelope merely nodded and sipped more water. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Tucker." "Gideon," he corrected automatically. "And there's no debt. Anyone would have done the same." A shadow crossed her face. "Not anyone," she murmured, then visibly collected herself. "Well, I won't impose on your kindness much longer. Once I'm steady on my feet, I'll be on my way." "And where might that be?" Gideon asked, realizing he knew nothing about this woman beyond her name. "East," she said after a pause. "I was headed to Cheyenne and then east." There was more to the story. Gideon could sense it in the careful way she spoke, in the flicker of her eyes, but it wasn't his place to pry. "Well, Miss Lawson, you won't be going anywhere until that fever's fully broken and you can stand without toppling over. Doc Wilson should make it out here tomorrow, God willing." Penelope didn't argue, which told Gideon more about her condition than her words could have. Instead, she asked, "Could you tell me what happened, how I ended up in the river? My memory is fragmented." Gideon shook his head. "I was hoping you could tell me. Found you being swept downstream, already half drowned, no sign of a horse or wagon nearby." Her brow furrowed as she seemed to search her memory. "I remember being on the stage to Cody. There was an incident. Men stopped the coach." Her hand drifted to her neck where a faint bruise was visible. "One of them grabbed me. I fought then. Nothing until waking here." "Robbery," Gideon surmised grimly. "Happens sometimes, though not often this close to town. They must have tossed you in the river, thinking you were dead or would be soon." Penelope's face hardened. "They underestimated me then." Something in the way she said it fierce despite her weakened state stirred something in Gideon's chest. He looked away, uncomfortable with the sensation. "Rest now. We can talk more later." Over the next week, Penelope's strength returned gradually. Doc Wilson confirmed she had pneumonia from her time in the river, but with rest and care, she would recover fully. The older man had given Gideon a knowing look that he pretended not to see. "She's a handsome woman, your river girl," Doc had said as he packed his medical bag. "Been a long time since I've seen you look at anyone that way, Gid." "Don't know what you're talking about," Gideon had muttered. "Just doing what any decent man would." Doc had only smiled. "If you say so." As Penelope regained her strength, she insisted on making herself useful. She couldn't yet manage the physical demands of ranch work, but she took over the cooking and mending, tasks Gideon had performed perfunctorily since Sarah's death. "These have seen better days," she commented one evening, examining his shirts with a critical eye. "Do you own a needle and thread, or shall I use hay and twine?" The teasing note in her voice drew another unexpected laugh from Gideon. "There's a sewing basket somewhere. Sarah's my wife's, probably in the trunk at the foot of the bed." Penelope's expression softened. "You lost her." It wasn't a question, but Gideon nodded anyway. 3 years ago, childbed fever, her and our son both. "I'm sorry." The simple words held genuine compassion without the cloying pity he'd come to hate from others. "It was a long time ago," he said, the familiar lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Penelope gave him a look that said she wasn't fooled. "Some wounds don't heal with time alone, Gideon. They need air and light." He turned away, uncomfortable with her perception. "I'll check on the horses." That night, unable to sleep on his makeshift pallet by the stove, Gideon stepped outside to clear his head. The spring air carried the scent of sage and new grass, and stars crowded the vast Wyoming sky. He didn't hear Penelope approach until she spoke. "It's beautiful here," she said, pulling a shawl one of Sarah's tighter around her shoulders. "I can see why you stay, despite everything." Gideon glanced at her, silver in the moonlight. "Should you be out in the night air? Your lungs are much improved," she finished for him. "And I needed to breathe something other than the inside of 4 walls, no matter how hospitable they've been." They stood in companionable silence for several minutes before Penelope spoke again. "I wasn't just going east," she said quietly. "I was running." Gideon waited, knowing she would continue in her own time. "My father arranged a marriage for me in San Francisco. A business associate of his, a man 3 times my age with a reputation for cruelty to his previous wives." She drew a shaky breath. "When I refused, my father made it clear I had no choice, so I fled. Everything I owned was in a trunk on that stage coach." "The men who robbed the stage," Gideon surmised. "They took it," Penelope nodded. "I have nothing now, no clothes save what you've lent me, no money." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Not even a hairbrush." "You have your life," Gideon said. "That's something." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "Yes, thanks to you, and I've been thinking about that debt." "I told you there's no—" "I know what you said," she interrupted gently. "But the fact remains that I need work and you need help here. I've seen how you manage this place alone, Gideon. It's too much for one person." He stiffened. "I've been managing fine." "Have you?" She gestured toward the barn, where aging fence posts leaned against the wall, waiting to be repaired. "That garden plot hasn't been turned in years. Your cattle are healthy enough, but that north pasture fence won't last another winter." "And when was the last time you ate something that wasn't salt pork or beans?" Her assessment, accurate as it was, stung his pride. "I get by." "Getting by isn't living," Penelope said softly. "I'm not proposing charity, Gideon. I'm proposing an exchange, room and board for honest work. At least until I can earn enough to continue east." Gideon should have refused. Having a single woman living under his roof would set tongues wagging in Cody, small as it was. But the thought of returning to his solitary existence after she left created a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't ignore. "Until spring roundup," he said finally. "That gives you 2 months to get on your feet. Then we'll see." Penelope's smile was like sunrise breaking over the Absarokas. "Thank you. You won't regret it." But as Gideon watched her return to the house, he wondered if he already did. The next morning, Gideon rode into Cody to purchase supplies and send telegrams inquiring about the stagecoach robbery. If Penelope was to stay, she would need more than Sarah's old dresses. which hung on her taller frame like sacks. Cody was little more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a dusty main street, but it served as a supply point for ranches scattered across the surrounding countryside. The general store, post office, and saloon formed the heart of the settlement, with a small church, schoolhouse, and assorted dwellings completing the picture. Martha Wilson, the doctor's wife and self-appointed town gossip, intercepted Gideon before he'd even dismounted in front of Hargrove's general store. "Gideon Tucker, is it true you've got a woman living at your place?" Her eyes gleamed with curiosity beneath her bonnet. News traveled fast in Wyoming territory, even with flooded roads. "Miss Lawson nearly drowned in the North Platte," he said tersely. "I pulled her out. She's been recovering." Martha's eyebrows rose. "All alone out there with you. My word, what would Sarah think?" The mention of his wife's name from Martha's lips kindled a rare anger in Gideon. "Sarah would think it better than leaving someone to die, Martha. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." He brushed past her, ignoring the hurt look on her face. Inside the store, Jeremiah Hargrove greeted him with a nod. "Heard about your rescue," the storekeeper said. "Terrible business, that holdup. 3 passengers killed from what the survivor said." Gideon's stomach clenched. "Miss Lawson is lucky to be alive then." "Indeed she is." Jeremiah leaned forward. "Sheriff's got a posse tracking those outlaws. Word is they've been hitting stages all along the eastern slope. Real vicious bunch." As Gideon selected the items he needed, fabric for dresses, a hairbrush, woman's boots in what he hoped was Penelope's size, he felt the weight of curious stares from other customers. By sundown, everyone in the county would be speculating about the woman at his ranch. Let them talk, he thought defiantly as he loaded his purchases. It changed nothing, but something had changed, he realized as he rode home. For 3 years, he'd moved through life like a ghost, going through the motions without truly engaging. Now, with Penelope's presence, colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. Even the ache of missing Sarah felt different, still present, but no longer all-consuming. He found Penelope in the garden plot, clearing away years of weeds with determined effort. She'd tied back her hair with a strip of cloth and rolled up the sleeves of Sarah's old dress. Dirt streaked her forearms and a smudge of it marked her cheek, but she looked more alive than any woman he'd seen in years. "You shouldn't be working so hard," he said, dismounting. "You're still recovering." Penelope straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "Honest work never killed anyone. Besides, if we're to have vegetables this summer, the ground needs turning now." "We," he thought, the word echoing strangely in his mind. How long had it been since he'd thought in terms of we rather than I? "I brought some things from town," he said, leading his horse toward the barn. "Fabric, mostly. Thought you might make use of it." Penelope followed him, curiosity brightening her face. "You bought fabric? For me?" Gideon felt heat rise in his face. "Can't have you wearing Sarah's old things forever. They don't fit right, and—" He trailed off, unsure how to express that seeing another woman in his wife's clothes created a dissonance he couldn't reconcile. Understanding softened Penelope's expression. "Thank you, Gideon, that's very thoughtful." He busied himself unloading the packages, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Sheriff's got a posse after the men who robbed your stage. 3 passengers killed." Penelope paled. "3? Do you know who?" Didn't ask for names. Gideon hesitated. "You remember anything more about them? The robbers?" She shook her head. "It happened so fast. 4 men, I think, bandanas covering their faces. One had a scar here." She traced a line from the corner of her eye down her cheek. "I saw it when his mask slipped. That's the one who grabbed me when I wouldn't hand over my locket." Gideon noticed her hand going to her throat again, where nothing now hung. "They took it." "It was all I had of my mother," Penelope said quietly. She died when I was 12. Inside was a miniature portrait of her and a lock of her hair, not valuable to anyone but me. The loss of something so personal seemed to affect her more deeply than the theft of her worldly possessions. Gideon remembered how he'd clung to Sarah's hairbrush after her death, unable to clean away the strands of her honey-colored hair. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Penelope squared her shoulders. "It's just a thing. I'm alive, which is more than can be said for those other passengers." She reached for one of the parcels. "Now, show me what you've brought. I haven't had new fabric in ages." Over the next few weeks, a routine developed at the Tucker ranch. Gideon rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, often returning to find breakfast waiting proper breakfast, with biscuits and gravy, not just cold Johnny cake as he'd grown accustomed to. Penelope worked in the garden, coaxed the ancient cookstove to produce increasingly impressive meals, and gradually transformed Sarah's old dresses into garments that suited her taller, more angular frame. They worked side by side mending fences, Penelope holding posts steady while Gideon drove them into the hard Wyoming earth. She learned to milk the cow, feed chickens, and even help with calving when one of the heifers had trouble. "You're not like any city woman I've ever known," Gideon commented one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and pink. Penelope laughed. "I was raised in San Francisco, yes, but my mother came from farm stock in Ohio. She made sure I knew how to work with my hands." Her expression grew wistful. "Father never approved. He wanted a decorative daughter to make an advantageous marriage, not one who knew how to butcher a chicken or turn soil." "His loss," Gideon said. "Out here, a woman who can't work alongside her husband doesn't last long." The word husband hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Penelope looked away first. "Will you tell me about her?" she asked softly. "About Sarah." The request caught Gideon off guard. For 3 years, he'd avoided speaking Sarah's name whenever possible, as if saying it aloud might somehow make the loss fresh again. "You don't have to," Penelope added quickly. "I just thought. Sometimes it helps to remember the good, not just the ending." Gideon studied the weathered boards beneath his boots. "She was small," he said finally. "Barely came to my shoulder, but strong in spirit. Moved out here from Kansas with her family when she was 16. We married a year later." The words came easier than he'd expected. "She loved spring best. Used to say it was God's way of showing that nothing stays dead forever." Penelope listened quietly as memories spilled from him like water from a broken dam. Sarah's laugh, her fear of thunderstorms, the way she sang to their cattle during milking, believing it made them give sweeter cream. "She wanted children something fierce," he continued, his voice roughening. "We tried for 5 years before James came along. She was so happy when she found out, sewed a whole layette before she was even showing." He swallowed hard. "The birth was hard, too hard. Doc Wilson did what he could, but there was so much blood." Penelope's hand found his in the gathering dusk, warm and steady. "She sounds wonderful, Gideon. Thank you for telling me about her." They sat in companionable silence until the first stars appeared. Gideon was acutely aware of Penelope's hand still resting in his, but couldn't bring himself to pull away. It had been so long since he'd experienced such simple human contact. "I should check on that heifer," he said eventually, reluctantly disentangling his fingers from hers. "Make sure she's not having any problems with the calf." Penelope nodded, rising from her chair. "I'll finish the dishes." As Gideon crossed to the barn, he felt lighter somehow, as if sharing memories of Sarah had eased a burden he'd carried too long. And beneath that lightness, a flicker of something he wasn't ready to name, something that made his heart beat faster when Penelope smiled at him. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Gideon was repairing a broken hame on one of his harnesses when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He stepped out of the barn to see 3 riders approaching Sheriff Dawson and 2 deputies, their badges catching the morning sun. "Gideon," the sheriff greeted him with a nod. "Hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Gideon replied, though unannounced visitors were rare enough to raise his suspicions. "Something I can help you with." Sheriff Dawson dismounted, a stocky man with a graying mustache and eyes that missed little. "We're looking for the woman you pulled from the river." "Miss Lawson, is it?" As if summoned by her name, Penelope appeared in the doorway of the house, wiping her hands on an apron. "I'm Penelope Lawson," she said, approaching the men. "How can I help you, Sheriff?" Dawson studied her carefully. "Madam, we caught up with those stage robbers yesterday. Nasty fight, 2 of them dead, 2 in custody." He removed his hat. "Found some personal effects we believe were stolen from passengers. Wanted to see if you could identify anything as yours." Hope flared in Penelope's eyes. "Yes, of course." The sheriff nodded to one of his deputies, who produced a small canvas sack and emptied its contents onto the hood of Gideon's wagon. There were several items: a pocket watch, a lady's reticule, a man's signet ring, and a small gold locket. Penelope's breath caught. "That's mine," she said, pointing to the locket with trembling fingers. "My mother's locket." "Can you describe what's inside?" Dawson asked, clearly a formality to confirm ownership. "A miniature portrait of my mother, Elizabeth Lawson, on the left. A lock of brown hair secured with blue thread on the right." Her voice was steady despite the emotion Gideon could see in her eyes. The sheriff nodded, satisfied, and handed her the locket. "It's yours, then. We'll need you to come to town sometime soon to give a formal statement about the robbery." Penelope clutched the locket to her chest. "Of course. Thank you for returning it." "There's something else, Miss Lawson," Dawson said, his expression grave. "One of the robbers we captured had quite a lot to say, trying to bargain for leniency. Mentioned a woman on the stage who fought back, said his partner tossed her in the river. Also mentioned that, before they hit the stage, they met a man who paid them to keep an eye out for a young woman matching your description. Paid extra to make sure she didn't reach Cheyenne." The color drained from Penelope's face. Gideon moved closer to her, instinctively protective. "Did this man give his name?" she asked. "No, madam, just that he was looking for his runaway daughter." Dawson watched her reaction carefully. "Would that be your father, Miss Lawson?" Penelope's shoulders straightened. "My father is Carlton Lawson of San Francisco. And yes, I left without his permission, but I'm 26 years old, Sheriff. Not a runaway child." "Never suggested you were," Dawson said mildly. "Just trying to understand the situation. This man, whether your father or someone working for him, essentially put a bounty on you. That makes this more than a simple robbery." "My father arranged a marriage for me to a man known to have abused his previous wives," Penelope said bluntly. "When I refused, he threatened to have me committed to an asylum for hysteria if I didn't comply. So yes, I fled. I've broken no laws, Sheriff." "Never said you did." Dawson replaced his hat. "But you should know the outlaw claimed this man is still looking for you, might have hired others." He glanced at Gideon. "Just thought you both should be aware." After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Penelope stood motionless in the yard, the locket still clutched in her hand. "He won't stop," she said finally. "Not until he finds me." Gideon had never felt such rage toward someone he'd never met. "You're safe here," he said, the words a promise he intended to keep. Penelope shook her head. "No one's safe around me, don't you see? I've put you in danger just by staying here." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should go. Now that I know he's actively searching, and go where?" Gideon demanded. "With no money, nowhere to hide. You'd be easier to find in Cheyenne or any other city than you are here." He took her hands in his, locket and all. "Stay, Penelope. We'll figure this out together." She searched his face. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You barely know me." The answer came to Gideon with surprising clarity. "Because in the 6 weeks you've been here, I've felt more alive than I have in 3 years. Because you've reminded me there's more to life than just surviving from one day to the next." He swallowed hard. "Because I can't bear the thought of returning to the emptiness that was my life before you washed up on that riverbank." Penelope's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, Gideon thought he'd said too much. Then she leaned forward and pressed those lips to his in a kiss so gentle it nearly broke him. "I'll stay," she whispered against his mouth. For now, it was enough. It had to be. As spring blossomed into early summer, the threat posed by Carlton Lawson receded in their daily concerns, though it never fully disappeared. Gideon taught Penelope to shoot, first with his old Navy Colt, and then with the lighter Remington he purchased specifically for her on his next trip to town. She proved a quick study, her aim steady and her resolve firm. "I won't be taken against my will," she said after successfully hitting a row of tin cans at 30 paces. "Not by my father's men, not by anyone." The determination in her voice stirred both pride and concern in Gideon. He admired her strength while wishing she'd never need to use it. Their relationship evolved with the changing season. What began as cautious attraction deepened into genuine affection, then blossomed into something neither was ready to name. They still slept separately, Penelope in the bed, Gideon on his pallet near the stove, but their days were filled with shared work, meals taken together, and increasingly intimate conversations as twilight gathered around the little ranch house. Word spread throughout the county about the woman living at Tucker's place. Some neighbors, like old Jim Halloran and his wife from the next ranch over, accepted the situation without comment, bringing over preserves and extending dinner invitations, as if Penelope had always been part of Gideon's household. Others were less charitable. "Reverend Phillips cornered me after services yesterday," Martha Wilson told Penelope when they crossed paths at Hargrove's store. "Said it wasn't proper, you living out there without benefit of marriage. Said he'd be happy to speak to Mr. Tucker about making an honest woman of you." Penelope selected fabric with deliberate care. "That's very considerate of the Reverend, but Mr. Tucker and I have an employment arrangement, nothing more." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Employment? Is that what they're calling it these days?" The insinuation stung, but Penelope maintained her composure. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. I keep house and help with the ranch work in exchange for room and board. A common enough arrangement out here, I believe. Between men, perhaps," Martha sniffed, "or with a housekeeper of a certain age. Not with a young, unmarried woman and a widower still in his prime." "Your concern for propriety is noted," Penelope said coldly. "Good day, Mrs. Wilson." She paid for her purchases and left the store with her head high, but Martha's words followed her back to the ranch. Was she compromising Gideon's standing in the community by staying? The thought troubled her deeply. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Penelope broached the subject. "People are talking about us, Gideon." He glanced up from the bridle he was mending. "People always talk. It's about the only entertainment in Cody. They're saying it's improper for me to stay here, that it damages your reputation." Gideon set aside the bridle. "Do you care what they think?" "I care what you think," Penelope replied honestly. "This is your home, your community. I don't want to be the reason people look at you differently." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Penelope, I've been the strange widower who barely speaks to anyone for 3 years. People already look at me differently." He leaned forward. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours." Her heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. "And what about your opinion of me? Does it bother you what they're saying?" "The only thing that bothers me," Gideon said quietly, "is the thought of you leaving." The admission hung between them, freighted with meaning. Penelope found herself moving toward him, drawn by something stronger than propriety or caution. When their lips met, it wasn't the gentle, questioning kiss of weeks before, but something deeper, hungrier. Gideon's arms encircled her, pulling her onto his lap as the kiss deepened. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, cradled her face with surprising tenderness. "Stay," he murmured against her lips. "Not as my housekeeper or ranch hand. Stay as—" "As what?" Penelope asked, breathless. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "As my wife. If you'll have me." The proposal was so unexpected that Penelope could only stare at him. "Gideon, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's sudden. I know you plan to go east eventually, but I love you, Penelope. I think I've loved you since I pulled you from that river and you fought to breathe again." He smiled ruefully. "Or maybe since you told me my shirts looked like they'd been mended by a blind man with a fork." A laugh bubbled up through Penelope's shock. "They did look terrible." "They did," he agreed, sobering. "Everything looked terrible before you, colorless, pointless." His hands tightened on hers. "You brought life back to this place, to me." Tears blurred Penelope's vision. "Gideon, I came here with nothing. No dowry, no family connections that aren't actively dangerous to you. I can't even offer you respectability, given how I've been living here. Do I look like a man who cares about dowries or society connections?" He brushed a tear from her cheek. "All I want is you, Penelope. Your strength, your kindness, your remarkable ability to make something from nothing." He paused. "But only if you want me to. If you still dream of going east, I don't," she interrupted. "Not anymore. My dream is here now." She took a deep breath. "Yes, Gideon, I'll stay. I'll be your wife." The smile that transformed his face was worth every hardship that had led her to this moment. When he kissed her again, Penelope knew she had found her home. They were married 2 weeks later in Cody's small church, with Doc Wilson and Jim Halloran standing as witnesses. Reverend Phillips, perhaps relieved to have the moral quandary resolved, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Even Martha Wilson offered grudging congratulations at the modest reception held at the saloon afterward. "Never thought I'd see the day," Doc Wilson said, clapping Gideon on the shoulder. "You were half dead yourself when Sarah passed. Now look at you like a man resurrected." Gideon's eyes found Penelope across the room, radiant in a new blue dress she'd sewn herself. "Feels that way sometimes," he admitted. "Like I died in that river with her, and we both came back to life together." As summer ripened toward fall, the newlyweds settled into married life with a joy that sometimes felt almost unreal to Gideon. Waking each morning with Penelope beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow they now shared, filled him with a contentment he'd never thought to experience again. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The garden Penelope had reclaimed produced a bounty of vegetables that she preserved for winter. The cattle grew fat on summer grass, promising a good profit at fall auction. They even began planning additions to the house, a proper kitchen, another bedroom for the children they both hoped would come. But shadows lingered at the edges of their happiness. Though no word came of Carlton Lawson or men searching for Penelope, she still practiced with her Remington daily, and Gideon found himself scanning the horizon whenever he rode his boundaries, alert for strangers. Their vigilance proved warranted on a crisp October afternoon. Gideon was mending the barn roof while Penelope hung laundry when the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. 3 riders appeared on the ridge road, moving purposefully toward the ranch. Penelope's hand went to her apron pocket, where she kept her revolver while working around the home. "Gideon," she called, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. He descended the ladder quickly, retrieving his Winchester from inside the barn door. "Get inside," he told her. "Use the back door. If there's trouble, I'm not hiding," she interrupted, drawing the Remington. "We face this together." There was no time to argue. The riders were closing the distance rapidly, and now Gideon could see that all three were well dressed, city men not the type who typically visited remote ranches unannounced. "Mr. Tucker," the lead rider called as they approached. "Gideon Tucker." Gideon stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. "That's me." The man, middle-aged with a neat beard and expensive clothing, dismounted. "My name is Edward Harrington. I'm an attorney from San Francisco." His eyes moved to Penelope, widening slightly. "And you must be Penelope Lawson or Tucker now, I understand. Congratulations on your marriage." Penelope's grip on her revolver tightened. "What do you want, Mr. Harrington?" The attorney gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are associates of mine. We've come on a matter concerning your father, Mrs. Tucker." "Whatever my father wants, the answer is no," Penelope said coldly. "I'm no longer subject to his authority." Harrington held up a placating hand. "You misunderstand. I'm not here on behalf of Carlton Lawson. I'm here because Carlton Lawson is dead." The news struck Penelope like a physical blow. Gideon moved to her side, supporting her as she swayed slightly. "Dead," she repeated. "How? When?" "6 weeks ago. Apoplexy." Harrington removed his hat. "I'm sorry to deliver such news so abruptly, but there was no gentle way to say it." Penelope's face was unreadable. "Why come all this way to tell me? A telegram would have sufficed." "Because, Mrs. Tucker, you are your father's sole heir. His estate is extensive properties in San Francisco, mining interests in Nevada, railroad stock." Harrington reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "All of it now belongs to you." The revelation was so unexpected that neither Penelope nor Gideon spoke for several moments. Finally, Gideon found his voice. "You're saying my wife is wealthy." "Extraordinarily so," Harrington confirmed. "Which is why I've come in person. There are documents to sign, arrangements to make. The estate cannot be fully settled without Mrs. Tucker's presence in San Francisco, at least temporarily." Penelope looked from the attorney to her husband, conflict clear in her expression. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing now," Harrington advised. "Read the documents I've brought. Discuss matters with your husband. We're staying in Cheyenne and can return in a week for your decision." He handed the envelope to Penelope. "Whatever you decide regarding the estate, please know that as your father's attorney, I am now at your service." After the attorney and his companions departed, promising to return the following week, Penelope sat at the kitchen table, the unopened envelope before her. "I hated him," she said finally, "for what he tried to force me into, for sending men after me." She looked up at Gideon. "Is it wrong that I feel nothing now that he's gone?" Gideon sat beside her, taking her hand. "You feel what you feel. No right or wrong to it. All those years, I thought if I could just please him, make him proud, he'd love me the way he loved my mother." She shook her head. "But he never saw me only what I represented, a business asset to be leveraged through marriage." Gideon squeezed her hand. "What do you want to do about the inheritance?" Penelope sighed. "I don't know. Part of me wants nothing to do with his money. But then I think of what we could do with it, expand the ranch, build a proper house, maybe even help others." She met his gaze. "What do you think?" "I think," Gideon said carefully, "that money itself isn't good or evil. It's just a tool. In your father's hands, it was a means of control. In yours, it could be something else entirely." He smiled slightly. "But whatever you decide, Remember that I didn't marry you for your unexpected fortune. I married you when your worldly possessions consisted of a borrowed dress and a gold locket." Penelope leaned forward and kissed him softly. "And that's why I love you, Gideon Tucker. You see me, the real me." They decided that Penelope would travel to San Francisco to settle her father's estate, with Gideon accompanying her. Jim Halloran agreed to look after their ranch during their absence, and by early November, they were on a westbound train, Penelope watching the landscape of her new home recede with mixed emotions. "It's strange," she told Gideon as they crossed the Sierra Nevada. "I spent my whole life in San Francisco, but it doesn't feel like going home. It feels like leaving it." He understood. Home wasn't a place, it was where they were together. San Francisco greeted them with fog and the constant clamor of a city growing too quickly for its foundations. Penelope's childhood home on Nob Hill stood like a mausoleum, grand and lifeless, staffed by servants who regarded the return of Carlton Lawson's daughter with poorly concealed curiosity. "He changed nothing after Mother died," Penelope observed as they toured the mansion. "It's exactly as I remember, down to the arrangement of her books in the library." The process of settling the estate was more complex than either of them had anticipated. There were businesses to review, properties to assess, investment decisions to make. Throughout it all, Gideon watched his wife with growing admiration. The strength he'd witnessed on their small ranch translated seamlessly to boardrooms and attorneys' offices, where Penelope quickly established herself as a formidable presence. "You're not what they expected," he commented one evening as they returned from yet another meeting. "They thought they'd be dealing with a naive country girl they could easily manipulate." Penelope smiled grimly. "They forget that before I was a rancher's wife, I was Carlton Lawson's daughter. I grew up watching him conduct business. I know their tricks." By Christmas, the most pressing matters had been resolved. Penelope had liquidated certain holdings, reinvested others, and made arrangements for ongoing management of the businesses she chose to retain. She also made several decisions that raised eyebrows among San Francisco's elite. "You donated how much to the women's hospital?" Harrington asked incredulously when she informed him of her latest disbursement. $50,000, Penelope repeated calmly. "With the stipulation that they establish a ward specifically for women suffering from abuse at the hands of their husbands." Her gaze hardened. "The same fate my father nearly condemned me to." She made similar donations to organizations supporting orphan children, destitute widows, and working women seeking education, causes her father would have dismissed as sentimental wastes of money. "You're creating quite a stir in certain circles," Harrington informed her, though Gideon detected a note of approval beneath the attorney's professional reserve. "There are those who feel you're being excessively charitable." "Let them feel however they wish," Penelope replied. "I have the luxury now of not caring about their opinions." By January, they were both eager to return to Wyoming. The city that had once been Penelope's entire world now felt stifling after the open spaces of their ranch. The social obligations that came with her new status as one of San Francisco's wealthiest women were particularly trying for Gideon, who endured dinner parties and opera performances with stoic forbearance but visible discomfort. "One more week," Penelope promised as they prepared for bed in the cavernous master suite that had once belonged to her parents. "Just until the last contracts are signed. Then we can go home. Home." The word encompassed everything they both longed for: their small ranch house with its creaking floors and temperamental stove, the rhythms of caring for land and animals, the vast Wyoming sky overhead. They returned to Cody in early February, to find their ranch blanketed in snow but otherwise exactly as they'd left it. Jim Halloran had kept everything in good order, though he confessed the chickens hadn't laid well in their absence. "Missed you, I reckon," the old rancher said with a wink. Temperamental creatures, hens. That night, as they lay in their own bed for the first time in months, Penelope curled against Gideon's side with a contented sigh. "I've been thinking about what to do with Father's money, our money now." Gideon stroked her hair, longer now than when they'd first met. "And what have you decided?" "I want to expand the ranch, yes. Build a better house, improve the stock." She propped herself up on one elbow. "But I also want to do more. I was thinking about a school, perhaps. A proper one with a qualified teacher, and maybe a small hospital. Cody's growing and the nearest real medical facility is too far away for emergencies." Gideon studied his wife's face, alight with purpose. "You want to invest in the community. In our home," she corrected. "This place, these people, they accepted me when I had nothing. Gave me a chance to build a new life." Her hand found his beneath the quilt. "I want to give something back." In the years that followed, Penelope and Gideon transformed not only their own ranch but the surrounding community as well. The Tucker Ranch expanded to encompass 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, with improved cattle breeds that commanded top prices at market. Their new house, while more spacious and comfortable than the original cabin, maintained a warmth and simplicity that reflected their values. The Penelope Tucker School opened in 1881, providing education to children from across the county, regardless of their family's ability to pay. The small hospital followed 2 years later, with Doc Wilson serving as chief physician until his retirement. Their personal happiness grew alongside their public works. In the spring of 1880, Penelope gave birth to their first child, a son they named William after Gideon's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed in 1882, and another son, James, in memory of the child Gideon had lost in 1885. Penelope's wealth allowed them comforts most ranching families couldn't imagine, but they lived without ostentation, teaching their children the value of hard work and community service. All 3 Tucker children learned ranching alongside their academic studies. Regardless of gender, Elizabeth could rope a calf as skillfully as either of her brothers, while William showed a gift for figures that promised to serve him well in managing the family's varied interests. On the 10th anniversary of the day Gideon had pulled Penelope from the North Platte, they rode together to the spot where he'd found her. The river flowed peacefully now, its spring fury months away. "I sometimes think about how close it was," Penelope said as they dismounted. "A few more minutes in that water and I wouldn't have survived. You wouldn't have found me in time." Gideon took her hand, the same strong, capable hand that had held his through a decade of joy and occasional sorrow. "But I did find you, and you did survive, and taught you how to live again." She teased, echoing words he'd spoken to her years before. "Every day," he said simply. "You teach me every day." As they stood by the river that had nearly claimed her life but instead had brought them together, Penelope reflected on the strange turns fate sometimes took. Had the stagecoach not been robbed, had her father not tried to force her into marriage, had Gideon not ridden to this spot on that particular morning, any change might have led them down different paths. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Pulling a half-drowned stranger from the river? Taking on all the complications I brought with me?" Gideon turned to her, his face weathered now by a decade of Wyoming sun and wind, but his eyes still holding the same tenderness they'd shown when he'd asked her to be his wife. "Not for a single moment," he answered. "Finding you was like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing." Penelope leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I came west looking for escape," she murmured. I never expected to find home." The setting sun painted the Absaroka Mountains gold as they mounted their horses for the ride back to the ranch, where their children waited. Behind them, the North Platte continued its eternal journey, a reminder of how close they'd come to never finding each other at all. Ahead lay the future. They'd built together a legacy of love that had begun with a desperate rescue and blossomed into something neither could have imagined on that fateful spring day when a cowboy found a woman nearly drowned, and in saving her, found salvation for himself.